Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our VVT solenoid gasket. Something that I'm going to mention to you is we're going to have to remove the oil filter housing from the engine. So keep in mind, if you remove that housing, you're going to be losing oil. Typically, if you do this job, you're going to probably do an oil change anyway. So go ahead and make sure you have 520 oil available, and of course make sure that you have the proper oil filter. Let's get started. Now the area we're going to have to access is going to be located behind the passenger side wheel. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this wheel. To do that, you want to make sure you safely raise and support the front of your car so the wheel's off the ground. Remove all 5 lug nuts and get the wheel off. With the wheel off of there, the next thing we want to do is get this right out of the way. That way there we have a nice clear view of our oil filter housing right here. You're going to find 3 push clips. One up in the corner over here, one right there, and then one right down there. After that, we'll pull this out of the way. We'll get this out of the way. Now with the splash shield out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our oil filter housing. Obviously, if you're going to be doing the oil change, you can go ahead and take off this oil filter. Aside from that, another thing to think about is you're going to want to make sure that you have a collection bucket underneath this area to collect any of the used oil that does come out. Now with all that said, we're going to move along to starting to disconnect some wiring. You're going to have the wiring that goes right here. You can squeeze the tab, draw the wiring right off of there. Also, you're going to find 2 wires that go up from the oil filter housing up in that direction to a harness. We need to dismount those as well. Anytime you remove an electrical connector, inspect it. If you see any funny colors in there, it's probably corrosion and it needs to be dealt with. This looks good, so we'll set it aside and continue on to the other 2 wires. So now the reason why we removed the wires from the wiring harnesses right there was because of course we're going to want to have all this wiring come out with the filter housing. Something that's common to happen on these though is that the wiring gets stuck on the mounting points up here. So you can try, and then it's just not going to come off. You definitely don't want to damage the wires, so I'm just going to continue by removing our 3 bolts. This bolt's a little longer than the first one. Now with the housing unbolted, typically you're going to be able to pull this right out of the vehicle. But unfortunately, we couldn't get our wiring out of the bracket up top, so I'm kind of stuck at this point here. The next thing that I'm going to do is remove my VVT solenoid from the filter housing by removing these 2 bolts. I want to be very careful not to put too much of a tug on that wiring, as little as possible obviously. I don't want to damage it. Okay. Now over a nice collection bucket, we'll go ahead and get this screen out of here. Set that aside. We're also going to remove this gasket right there. Now you want to clean up the mating surfaces along this area here where that gasket was, and of course along this area where this gasket was. Also up on the engine where this is going to mount. Now let's clean the back side of the solenoid as well. Now let's put our gasket on here. I'm going to put the screen facing this way. That way there it's facing away from the engine once this is installed. Now let's get our gasket on here. Now we're going to mount the VVT solenoid onto our oil filter housing. Just bear with me because like I said, typically this can be done away from the engine. Our wiring harness is stuck on here, so I'm just going to continue on putting it on this way. We'll line it up, start both of our bolts in, then we'll snug them up. Now, once you have both of those bolts tight, you're going to go ahead and torque them to 8.7 foot-pounds. Okay, do the same to the other one. Make sure the gasket's in there completely. Line this up with the engine. Start in all 3 bolts, and then we'll snug them up and torque them to 16 foot-pounds. You'll notice one of your bolts is longer than the other 2. The longest bolt is going to go on the top forward hole. Now let's start putting in all the wiring. If you disconnected the upper ones, make sure those are clipped back in and secured. And then of course we'll do this lower one right here. Click it in, give it a nice tug. Let's get our splash shield back into position. Grab our push clip, slide it through the hole, and then push in the centerpiece. Do the same to the rest. Now let's go ahead and get the wheel on here. We'll put all the lug nuts on, snug them up, get the wheel on the ground, and torque the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. Let's torque them to 80. Torqued.